John Pienaar, I'm afraid, has been called to a meeting with the Chancellor. So John Pienaar is therefore not here for our conversation with Armando Iannucci, which is definitely his loss. I would have had a chance to listen to this conversation, but now I'm going to have the pleasure of conducting it, and which I apologize to all of you, means I'm going to be sitting up here quite a bit for the rest of the conference, so you're going to have to put up with me moderating on from here. But I had a couple of my young Chatham House colleagues, I was just saying to Armando a second ago, saying, God, these are the questions you've got to ask. I remember this episode of the Veep, I remember that moment in the thick of it. So I've been thrown a few ideas to raise with you. But Armando, first of all, thank you very much for taking the time to join us. This is a conference on world order in the balance, but you in your career have been able, I suppose, to get the needle and prick in the bubbles of big ideas and take politics down to, in some cases, it's tragicomic or satirical, perhaps, reality. We will discuss that in a minute. But for those of you, as this is an international audience, not full of Brits and Americans, although there are a few of us here, but many others from around the world, Armando Iannucci has really had a career as a satirist, as a writer of comedy, of political satire, that's really been one of the most successful in the United Kingdom. BBC was his starting place, the day today, which gave birth to, I suppose, the character Alan Partridge, who still continues to be somebody that certainly on the UK side people are always waiting to hear his next piece of wisdom. He wrote In the Thick of It, which many more people here who are not Brits tend still to watch Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. And for us Brits, In the Thick of It was the reboot, the update in the early 2000s of what was maybe the more genteel era of the Thatcher period. Certainly the levels of profanity that one finds in the thick of it were not present between Sir Humphrey and his minister and prime minister, at least not on the screen. Then in 2012 he helped design the Veep, which many of our American participants, as well as some of the Brits here and others, hopefully will have seen. Again, the somewhat tragicomic experiences of a vice president, as the Selina Meyer, played by the wonderful Julia Louis-Dreyfus. And now, 2017, we've timed this. We really didn't plan it this way.
No.
With your the premiere of Death of Stalin, your film. You did a film in the loop of the thick of it, but this is, I don't know if it's your second film, therefore.
Second film, yes.
Second film, which just premiered last Friday.
Yeah.
And here in the UK, and we'll discuss maybe a little bit where it's going to go after that. So that, I've set up Armando Iannucci, but we just thought, what an opportunity to have somebody who looks at politics from a completely different angle, not least as we've talked a lot in this last day and a half, you weren't here, but about the need for politicians and those in policy to communicate, and that the capacity to communicate or not becomes incredibly important in today's world. So let's just kick off. Again, welcome. Thank you for taking the time. It's the morning. I'm sure your evenings are even busier with all of the premieres and other showings you've got to go to of your new film. But how strange is it, Armando, to start from the beginning, with reality being stuff that we would have imagined to be in one of your pieces?
Well, yes.
That seems just real. Yeah. Is that going to take away your capacity to write your next thing?
No, I mean, it did strike me when Theresa May did her speech, last week, 2 weeks ago, and the letter falling off behind her.
Yes.
I did think if that was in a script of the thing of it, I would have said no. That's too crazy.
Obvious.
That's route one. You know, that's just corny. It's it's obvious. Let's not do that. And it used to be when we did the thick of it, we would try and think of the stupidest, most embarrassing thing to happen. We'd invent stuff. And then you'd find out that a politician would ring up afterwards and say, how did you hear about that? We thought we'd kept that quiet. Or else it would come true. In the very first episode of The Thick of It, we have a minister on his way to make an announcement, a big spending announcement, told he can't spend any money, so they sit in the back of a car with his advisors trying to improvise policies that won't cost any money. And we were actually driving to the location where we were going to do the press conference. So I did say, we've got the cameras, why don't you improvise some policies?
Right.
So we had all these actors just for spending 10 minutes improvising policies. And 3 of them then became law within the next 3 or 4 years.
No.
No. They came up with pet ASBOs. Everyone should have their own plastic.
Pet ASBO.
Pet ASBOs,
That's
yes.
not abusing, for those who don't know what ASBOs are. Yeah.
So behavior restriction orders on dangerous animals. Everyone should have their own plastic bag, so you don't have to buy them in shops. And Chris Addison came up with a national spare room database, which became the bedroom tax about 7 or 8 years later. So that's one of the reasons I stopped making the show, because I just thought this cannot happen.
You'd have to run for office.
Yeah.
Even America.
Yes, I think we should write one episode where everything works really well, and Brexit is sorted and it's fine. You know, so there's that. But also, I think the point of no return came with Donald Trump, because I sort of feel there's no point trying to mimic him in a way, or try and do a fictionalized version of him, because he is his own fiction. He is his own. Look, satire or comedy is all about taking elements of the truth and then bending them and twisting them and stretching them. But that's what he does in every tweet that he writes. He distorts the truth. And he sort of knowingly does it in a way, really, to create his own truth. So there's no point, you know. He's his own self-basting satirist is what I call it. So there's no point. But I think what's interesting is that the comedians in America who are at least having some kind of, who are able to come up with some kind of effective response to that, are the ones who have turned into journalists. You know, John Oliver, who does Late Night Last Week, or the chat show hosts, Samantha Bee, The Daily Show. What they've done is they've hired just teams of researchers and journalists to actually explore stories. If Trump is saying, you lot are fake news, into this hypothetical vacuum that he's suggesting have stepped comedians who have turned into journalists who say, okay, well, let's look at the facts. Here's a clip of you saying this. Here's a clip of you 3 years ago saying the opposite. Here's something you said last week is going to happen this week. Here's how it didn't happen this week. You know, and just
so that becomes the show.
So that becomes the show.
Truth is the show.
The comedy arises from setting out the facts. You know, obviously in an amusing order, but and I think that's possibly, and it has taken a little while for comedians to adjust to Donald Trump and try and work out what is the response, because, you know, and that thing you were saying about reality also is, you know, it seems to be a contest between reality and a sort of contrived reality, which is what he's about. You know, he calls the alternative facts and the alternative truths that he posits. And what seems to be happening is that politics has become a kind of, I mean, you call it reality show, but that's an ironic thing, because it makes it feel unreal. It makes it feel like it's an entertainment, and therefore having no consequences. And he's capitalized on that. And it's interesting that even though he's not managed to achieve very much, you know, his core support will say, in a way, that doesn't matter. It's what he represents. That's why we're still voting for him. That's why we're still supporting him.
But therefore, are you in a way confirming Trump's own truth by creating this separation, in a way, between those who are trying to hold him to account, and his view that actually I'm holding all the people who were not held to account before. I'm speaking the truth, in a way. I'm saying the things that other people think but daren't say.
Well, it's not that what other people think, it's what other people feel, you know, which isn't necessarily. I remember seeing a Trump supporter in the election, in the run-up to the election, saying to a journalist, crime has gone up. And the journalist was saying, well, it hasn't, actually. Here are the facts. It's gone down in the last 2 or 3 years. And he said, no, crime has gone up. And the journalist said, no, here are the facts. It has gone down. And then the supporter said, no, but people feel that crime has gone up, and that's a better truth.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, that's where the problem is. That's the danger I feel we have to confront. But it's also the responsibility now of anyone, whether they're in politics or whether they report in politics. It's not just, I mean, you talked about communication. I think it's more than communication. I think it's explaining. I think what politicians don't do enough is explain. And I think in the last Brexit debate, part of the problem was, I think for the Remain camp, a lot of people within supporters of Remain assumed everyone knew what all the phrases meant, what a single market meant as opposed to European Union. Yep. And they just use the phrase. Maybe it's because we operate more and more in a bubble where we talk to people who know what it is we are talking about, and we assume everyone else does the same. And actually, not enough time was taken, I feel, to explain the basics of what was being voted on.
But do you think that with the characters that you developed on the political series, In the Thick of It, the Veep in particular, that what you presented were the politicians that many people thought were in control, completely out of control? I mean, either incompetent or deeply self-focused, which I suppose in politics one has to have a certain amount of ego to be driven. But that sense that they were out of control, that they were having to, as you said, make up policies in the car. Then when Trump comes along, well, you know, what the hell? I'll take one type of out of control from another type of out of control. Did you capture something that's become a reality that has, I suppose, made it very difficult for politicians to be taken seriously?
Well, I think, and I've said this often enough, I mean, I find the most human character within these shows the elected politician. That's the one I kind of feel for. It's the fact that he or she can't do what it is they wanted to do because of pressures from not just their advisors saying, be cautious or go this way, don't say that, try not to do this. It's not just that. It's not just the centralized authority, like in the thick of it, number 10 coming down in the form of Malcolm Tucker saying, you haven't got any money, you can't do this. Or in Veep, maybe the president saying, no, I don't want to do that, so you can't go out and say that. It's not just that. It's actually the pressure that the 24-hour media puts on them so that they're expected to step in front of a camera any time of day or night and speak perfect sense. Have a solution to every problem that's put to them, answer the question directly, but within the 1-minute time slot available. It's not just that, but it's also us, the electorate. We expect them to be perfect. We expect them to always be there. We hate it when they go on holiday. We don't think they should earn any money. They should have an absolutely blameless past life, and anything they wrote on Twitter or on social media, even 15 years ago, as is happening in the case of one Labour MP just now, you know, they should be held to account for that. And therefore, I think we make life difficult for politicians, really. And the only reason I started making shows like that is that you write what you're passionate about, and I care about politics. I want it to work, and I want democracy to stay healthy.
So what do you, if you want democracy to stay healthy, did that just get you into wanting to write about politics, or do you think you're hoping that what you've written will have an impact?
Well, I hope so, because
in fact, so what impact if you do?
Yeah, going into, there were two reasons I started to think of it. One was a personal anger and frustration when Tony Blair took Britain into the war with Iraq with George Bush, despite the fact that everyone was saying, this is, you don't know this is going to be a mess. And all the evidence was there to say that it was going to be a mess. And I sort of thought, how does that happen? And it happens because in the UK, if you're a prime minister with a large majority, you have absolute power. You make the law, you pass the law, you have the budget, you run the departments, you appoint who runs the departments, you have complete control. In a way that we don't in other European powers, and even in America, Donald Trump is finding he doesn't have absolute power because, he doesn't make the law. That's Congress. He doesn't judge the law. That's the Supreme Court. He just has to administer the law. So that was the first point. But also, I wanted to show how decisions are made and how actually they could be made through a series of flaws and compromises. And, when we go past ministerial buildings, they look grand and imposing, but the truth is it's people inside doing what everyone does in a day of work, which is like think, I think I got away with it today. Yeah. But also the assumption we all have that decisions, major decisions, are made over a long, long period of time with long consideration. When no, it's like, this has to be decided now. Okay, yes then. Okay, thank you. And then you have to deal with it. And that's what I wanted to show, really. I didn't know what the effect would be, but I kind of wanted to show that in the hope that maybe, you know, ministers or people could go into politics to say, okay, maybe there's a different way of doing it.
And just on a side on this, the level of profanity in the thick of it is astounding. It's actually quite almost artistically done. But I mean,
thank you very much.
What is the?
I won't use any of it here today.
It demonstrates exactly what the English language can achieve. But what, or the British language probably in that case. But tell me, what is there an angle on that? Is that simply communicating frustration? Is it a way of delivering power?
Well, it is. I researched. You know, I spoke to people who worked in these situations: former ministers, journalists who knew ministries, civil servants, press and media spokespeople, and they did say it was a highly charged, testosterone-filled environment. Yeah. A lot of verbal abuse going on, and people, certain people, not all people, but certain people, you know, under the circumstances, swear a lot. And I thought, well, to get that reality, to make it feel convincing, we have to put this language in. But on the other hand, there's nothing more boring than one person saying the same swear word again and again. So we have to make the swearing interesting. So it's a kind of literary challenge to the writers to make each swear be surrounded by a flourish of more, you know, colourful
and were you getting,
description.
Were you getting a fair amount of input from? I mean, did you have your moles, you know?
Or which swear words do?
Well, no, actually, the swear words could have been good too. But in general, in terms of picking the storylines,
no, absolutely, and that was
you
the
must
same.
have had people wanting to see it up there.
Yeah, that was the same with Yes Minister. They had people in the Callaghan and Thatcher government telling them stories. There's a famous episode where I think they're in Saudi Arabia and there's no alcohol, but they've got another room next door full of alcohol. Right. And they have code words, like there's a Mr. Gordon to speak to you on the phone. And it's, if you want to go buy for a gin. And I was told that was true. That was based on a true story. So we are told things. But what I say is, look, I'm not out for the scandal. It's not a documentary. It's not an expose. I actually just want to know the boring detail. What time do you get in the morning? What time do you go home? What are the people like that you work with? What are the surroundings like? And then gradually you get a picture of who the key people are and what life is like. The fact that, you know, the bulk of the civil servants would go home at 6 o'clock, but there'd be... and also how young some advisors are. That's the other thing. The thing I noticed in Washington, researching for In the Loop and Veep, is somebody did say to me, you know, in this city there is a lot of power, and if you can just get a desk and a chair and sit somewhere near power, some of that power will come your way. You know, get in the meeting. If you're not in the meeting, you're not in power. And they told me that, you know, Madeleine Albright, when she was Secretary of State, taught her staff what she called bladder diplomacy, which was how to get through an 8-hour day without going to the lavatory, because the chances were, as soon as you left the room, a key decision would be made. And other younger sort of staffers told me that they used to know who were the key figures, and they would just hang around outside their door in the hope that they would kind of be swept in and join a meeting. And or if they play tennis, you know, they would learn tennis so that they can meet them at a tennis court and talk that way. And so on.
There have been quite a few reports that on the Trump presidency is rather similar, because again,
they're all take up
power
golf,
is so concentrated there that the being there element, you had huge meetings of people just lined up around the wall because you can't afford not to be there.
Yes, and when we went round the West Wing, which is a labyrinth of very small, poky corridors, the number of people who had made a sort of temporary office, just finding a chair in the hallway and just sitting with a laptop. And they looked like 4-star generals and so on. Because they wanted to say they worked in the West Wing, there were tons of free space across the road in the Eisenhower building, but no one wants to work there. You want to ring up and say, I'm calling from the West Wing. Which somebody said they could hear. They loved ringing up saying, hi, I'm calling from the West Wing, because they knew the person at the end of the phone was going, it's the West Wing. You know, they could hear them do that. And they genuinely did say, since I started working in the West Wing, I used to date 6s and 7s, but now I'm dating 7 and 8s. That's what they actually said. Just that kind of the aphrodisiac of power, you know.
You've mentioned,
people are nodding there.
You've mentioned the West Wing, and
yes.
In a way we've gone from a world of the West Wing to the House of Cards.
Yes.
Yeah? So the world of potential optimism to a world of darkness now.
Well,
House of Cards was written originally in the...
And it's criminal. I mean, what I say is none of the politicians in my shows commit a crime.
Right.
You know, they're just trying to get through the day, you know, one way or other. They may have to compromise their principles, but no one is killed.
But do you think there's a danger that in today's world, young people will treat politics as comedy or as drama, and in a way not want to get involved? I know you said part of why you got involved in this is you wanted to engage people, show them the reality, but is the danger that the showing the reality is going to turn people off wanting to get involved, that we've already got the lure of the startup? You know, you don't have to choose between either being in a large multinational where you get buried under a sort of corporate bureaucracy versus government bureaucracy. Now you can do startups, you can do...
Well, I
what do you think?
I don't against... I mean, I thought the last election in the UK, something quite promising happened there because, you know, it was called for fairly obvious reasons. We didn't have to call it because we've now got this law where elections are every 5 years. But Theresa May called it because she fundamentally was ahead in the polls and thought, I want to cash in. I want to have a larger majority so that I can effectively do what I like. Now, I'd argue, not just through my work, but the work of, you know, a number of journalists and just a general perception of how politics work now, I think a lot of the country saw through that. And they felt, well, hang on a minute. You can't just call an election because you want to. What are the issues here? You want to make it all about Brexit, but what are the issues? And two things, I think, happened. One was the vote numbers, the number of people who voted went up. It was a healthy turnout. And the number of young people registering for the first time, voting for the first time, went up by a huge amount. So that kind of indicates, actually, that people managed to see through the dressing up, the kind of, this is what the strategists are saying you should do with this election, managed to see through that, and actually decided, no, we're going to participate in an election because we want to discuss the issues. We want to engage with the debate. We want to engage with the debate about, I don't know, tuition fees as well as Brexit, or education as well as Brexit, or the health service as well as Brexit. So I saw that as a hopeful sign, really, because it means that politicians now can't use that easily readable, very transparent, cynical ploy in terms of, you know, asking people to vote. So it was also because I think a lot of people might have slept through the referendum debate and woke up and thought, oh, I see.
Elections matter.
Yeah, votes matter. Votes matter.
Yeah. And maybe by exposing people to cynicism, people in a way want to overcome the cynicism. Just as we're around the time, and I want to open it up, I hope you've got questions and thoughts, and maybe you have your favorite episodes. You want to know whether this was a bit of truth or not, or how much truth was in it. But Death of Stalin has come out. A different space. Now, maybe the same theme, control power, but it's around the death, obviously, of a hyper-powerful leader, then the grapple for power that takes place around him. Just tell us, first of all, something about what got you into that. Why?
Okay, well, I mean, as you say, the Death of Stalin is based on sort of the 10 days between Stalin falling ill with a ultimately fatal stroke and his funeral. And in those 10 days, it's the power struggle as to who takes over, fight between the reformers and Lavrenti Beria, who was the head of Stalin's henchmen for the last 20 years, responsible for all the rounding up the lists of people sent to the gulags, shot or sent to prison, and the fear that he might take over, and it's the power struggle between those two. And initially, after doing Veep, I was actually looking at contemporary dictatorship, with a view to maybe doing like a fiction, maybe what happened if a dictator took over the UK. And this was like 3 or 4 years ago, and this was watching, you know, the rise of these new populist movements. I mean, you've got Berlusconi for quite a while in Italy, Le Pen in France, an element of it within Farage and UKIP here.
Central Europe, you got to be.
Central Europe, you know, the strong leader.
Well, internationally, by the way, you could say as well. I mean, we've got the Chinese 90th Party Congress going on at the moment, but carry on.
Yes, the strong leader in Turkey, Czech Republic now. And this was pre-Trump as well. But aware of Putin and how he is selling the idea of the strong leader, centralized control. So I thought that'd be an interesting thing to look at and as a contemporary project.
But the leader's not there. So what's the twist? I mean,
just the circumstances were, there is a French graphic novel called The Death of Stalin, which recounts these, and it's based on a lot of true events. The film company who owned the rights approached me and said, have a look at this, and I read it. And I thought, well, that's the story. Why invent something when we have this series of facts here, this historical event here to look at? So that was the kind of the starting point for that film.
And there's been, obviously, the reviews here have been very favorable. The reviews in Moscow and other places are proving less favorable. I mean, do you see yourself trying to do...
The reviews of people who haven't yet seen the film, by the way. Yes.
The timing, which, as you said, is not deliberate, of it being with the 100th anniversary of the revolution. A very interesting Levada poll that I was reading just before this that came out. And what's the greatest person, Russians were asked, the greatest person of all nations, of all eras?
Stalin,
number one. And that's the view today.
Yes.
So you're treading on interesting territory, if you see what I'm saying. This is taking on the strong men is a thing.
And we went out to Russia, researched in Russia, spoke to people there, and I did ask them, what are you taught about Stalin at school? The younger people there. And they said, we're taught. Some people say he was responsible for the death of millions. Others say he made us a great power and won the patriotic war. You decide. It's left ambivalent. But you're right. He's still, the hotel we were staying at in Moscow had a portrait of Stalin up. It was among other famous visitors to that hotel. So there was a portrait of Brezhnev was up, a portrait of Chuck Norris was up. It was just basically just anyway. But you going around Moscow, you see I think a bust of Stalin went up a couple of weeks back. But there's also a statue of Tsar Nicholas II is up. So it's sort of almost like, irrespective of where they come in the political spectrum, if they're recognized as authoritarian figures, that's something to be projected.
But you are with the tide on spotting the loss of control in democracies. Are you against the tide in a way because these strong leaders are emerging, because there's a demand for them? What do you feel if you just project out your
I mean, my feeling is, and as I say, this film we shot it last summer, so it was pre the Brexit vote and pre-Trump. But it's coming out at a time when people see parallels with
people
Trump.
Are reading a lot into it.
He's, Stalin called anyone who disagreed with him an enemy of the people, and Trump calls them fake news. It's that attempt to delegitimize opposition. Now he's actually trying to delegitimize it through law by threatening to take away the broadcasting license of NBC because they broadcast fake news, and I find that troubling. I think what there is there's a danger that once you have democracy, you think it's permanent and that it's perfect, and therefore you don't have to do anything else. You're there. You've reached the summit, and you can lie back. And it's not. You have to permanently renew it. You have to constantly defend it. You constantly have to explain it. You constantly have to be forensic in your analysis of it. And therefore, I think what has happened is that a lot of democratically elected politicians have gone for this, not middle approach, but have narrowed their focus on the tiny amount that will make the difference.
Yes.
The swing vote. And they're so concentrated on them that they've forgotten about their loyal bases on the left and the right. And what these loyal bases have now done, have said, well, if you're not talking to me, we'll look elsewhere on the left and on the right. So you have Trump as well as Bernie Sanders. You have Jeremy Corbyn as well as Jacob Rees-Mogg. And there is that great kind of disorientating instability going on amongst the electorate.
So the danger, in a way, and this is a good moment to swing over half an hour in, get some viewpoints. But you give me this thought that democracies, the way they've operated recently, with the pressures of 24-hour news, etc., are driving people more and more to the swing vote. Somebody said the other day, there aren't vehicles in a way for a broader will of the people anymore. It's not the NGOs, it's not companies, it's not even political parties in many cases anymore. But you can really make a difference by picking the right constituency, the right segment of the vote.
And it's become a kind of almost scientific approach with algorithms and now through social media targeting individual voters with variations of a message. You know, targeting different regions with variations of a message.
But it may mean that democracies are far more vulnerable at the moment than
many
more centralized systems of government.
And not just that, you know, the whole question of power residing in a country now, or within a country's government, is open to question. Just because of the influence across boundaries and across continents with the information economy and with companies like Apple and Google and Facebook who have, you know, unlimited power and an economy larger than, you know, than most nations. And I think we kind of let them grow and get on with it untrammeled because we thought, well, fundamentally, they're nice people. They just want us to know stuff. What's wrong with that? And now we're waking up to the fact that they have a tremendous influence that if they themselves aren't particularly overtly using, can be abused, you know.
Well, this is, I think, partly the discussion of the last panel about just believing intrinsically that the liberal economic order rules itself, the market rules itself in an effective way, and the last panel discussed how to try to balance that a little bit differently. Right, look, let's get some viewpoints, thoughts, questions, and I've got lots more otherwise, but a hand going up there, I'll take 2 or 3. 1, 2, 3, There, please, thank you. I'm going to come down somewhere in there. Who was it?
Hi.
Hello, hi.
Question for you.
Just introduce yourself, Penny.
Hi, I'm Penny Noss. I'm from the company UPS. I have a question for you about Harvey Weinstein. And probably the most shocking, unshocking story that's out there at the moment. And I think the UK has seen this also in the political realm. But a question about kind of how do we move forward with regards to the issue around gender or sexual misbehavior, because reading all the stories, frankly, I feel ashamed that I didn't report it, as opposed to feeling anger that this was allowed to go on and our democratic systems have let half of our population down. And in fact, all the stories talk about victims as opposed to talking about perpetrators. And I'm just curious for your thoughts on that, particularly since Veep played with it kind of in reverse at certain points.
We just take that one, because that's a very specific, we don't have a big panel up here. You take that question.
No, I think that's a good point. You know, and I've been saying, with someone like Harvey Weinstein, the fact that he could threaten and indeed seem to succeed in ruining certain people's careers kind of indicates it's not just him. He must have been able to phone someone and say, don't employ this, you know, because that. So, which indicates, I'm sure there's far, far more to come out, not just about him, but by other people who kind of colluded in that. And the other thing is, it's not just about female victims coming forward, it's about men who have been told stories like this, because in a lot of the accounts of the actresses who spoke out, they said they maybe, at the time, maybe have then spoken to a male friend about what happened, and, you know, and that sort of. You know, it's important that men speak out as well as women, so that no one person feels isolated and feels that they're, you know, swimming against the tide and speaking out, I think.
And just in your research and in your world, to what extent did this sort of abusive treatment of women feature either within your episodes of shows like The Thick of It or even The Veep? How much was the gender issue that we're now debating so intensely something you wanted to get out, did get out? Would you have done it differently now? What do you think on that front?
I'm trying to think, because I always, with Think of It and Veep, I always thought we should be you know, any part that came up should be non-gender or non-color specific. You know, we just cast whoever would be you know, and I'm pleased that actually with both the Think of It and Veep, we had the central characters were great comic actresses, with Rebecca Front in The Thick of It, and Julia Louis-Dreyfus in Veep. And to me, that just seemed like, well, why not? You know,
I throw it out there partly because people have noted recently the level of profanity in politics, and this has come up in some reports here, is seen by many women actually as something that knocks them back.
Yes,
you know,
absolutely.
I have to be as profane as that to succeed.
No,
if I don't want to.
That was the impression I got from researching The Thick of It. It was a very male, testosterone-filled environment, and so that language was very current. It's almost like a kind of male swagger. even though it's people ultimately proving ineffectual. And the thing about any episode of The Thick of It is that Malcolm Tucker fucks it up. It's the moment he gets involved and tries to sort it that it gets worse. Yeah. And yet somehow he manages to walk away, having none of the blame, and manages to put the blame all on the minister. Because of this kind of hyper verbose, abusive kind of language.
Drives everyone backwards, defeated almost. Right, we've got a lot more hands. First here, and then go here, then there. Yep.
Krista Baumane. I am from a think tank in Riga, Latvia. So one of the countries that has been, where almost every family has been touched by Stalin's purges.
Yes.
And I saw the film on Sunday. Very lucky coincidence. I can't really find the right words to describe it, because to say brilliant or amazing would not be really appropriate. But I think it is amazing to some extent how you, with comedy, have shown the absurdity of the system. And
oh, well, thank you.
Whereas through watching a documentary, I mean, many people would not probably care. Watch documentary on Stalin, today.
We did speak to people who had been through that, and what it was like, in the knocks on the door in the middle of the night and so on. And in the film, if those who haven't seen it, I mean, we don't shrink back from showing the effects. All the comedy happens within the higher echelons of power and their struggle for survival, but their decisions impact on hundreds of millions of people, and we do show straight, without any jokes, what happens, so the effects of the purges, but also the liberalization after Stalin died, families being torn apart and then reunited, or people just disappearing quite arbitrarily. But that was about actually engaging with people there, and I said to the whole production team on day one, we have to be respectful of what happened. We can't dress it up or hide it or pretend it didn't happen. So it was about showing that while extending the comedy within the higher up within the political hierarchy.
I think you succeeded. I think the level of detail in the film is amazing.
Oh, thank you.
Down to the tomato in Khrushchev's pocket.
I didn't know about the tomato in Khrushchev's pocket, but you do.
But, I do, and I highly recommend it. It's excellent.
Yes.
Brilliant. Right. Sorry, if you pass the microphone here, just behind you, back a little bit, and then I'm going to go to the lady there. Yeah.
Hi there. I think this is, Indra Adnan from The Alternative. I think this is a building conversation. So what is the alternative is my question to you. Only 2% of people in the UK are members of political parties. And our media is very codependent with that 2% discourse. Yes. So political discourse is a kind of bubble, right? Yeah. And within that bubble, anything that is genuinely democratic looks like populism.
Yes.
Right, but if you step outside that bubble, you're looking at genuine development, democratic development. So municipalism, localism, federalism, these are things that are happening outside of this bubble. They never get talked about.
Yes.
So my question to you is, what is an alternative hero for these times?
Well, I mean, you're right. I mean, fewer people are members of a political party. And I think that's because we now have a generation growing up who don't quite buy into the notion of a political party. Everyone makes their own playlist. It's not buying a whole album and you have to have all these songs. You can now select, that's the way we're growing up. And therefore, people think, well, I agree with that policy, but not necessarily that one. So why should I sign up to all these policies? And I think politicians haven't quite adapted to that kind of new generation. What has grown is a participation in single-issue politics. So you will get massive demonstrations for this, or campaigns for that, or protests about the other, and that I think is where social media has helped, in that people are able to reach out and find similarly minded activists and organize. Where I feel the danger is in social media, and what we need to do something about, is that social media also gives us a way of shutting down engagement with anyone who disagrees with us. Yep. Because we can block, if I get an abusive remark on Twitter, I can block them. Yep. But if I get someone who disagrees with me in Twitter, I can block them as well, or I can unfollow them. And I think that's what's happening. And we're making ourselves debate only with like-minded people, which means that there is a danger we get into that situation where we say, you disagree with me, and therefore you're wrong. and because you're wrong, I don't feel safe in your presence. So can you leave now? You know, we get into that non-platforming, and also whenever we see a view on Twitter or Facebook, the way people don't engage with the argument, but engage with the person by making abusive remarks about the person is becoming troubling. So I think that's a real problem, that yes, we do have a generation now who are committed to single issue politics, but we also have a mindset now where it's becoming less the default to actually engage in debate, in proper civil argument. But I don't know why we aren't taught not politics as in party politics at school, but why we just aren't taught how the political system works at school. We're taught sex education and health and drugs, but we aren't taught, here's how voting works, here's how you register, here's the main parties, this is their fundamental stances. Here are other ways in which you can take part. Here's how local government works, here's how the money, the tax money that you will end up paying, here's how it's distributed, here's how the machine works, here's what the trade, they do it in America, they do civics, and I don't know why we don't do that. And there's a wariness of engaging young people in politics.
But I think part of the question was, what's the alternative type of leader? You described the context perfectly, very clearly.
But we're seeing that alternative.
What sort of
we're
leader
seeing that alternative leader emerge. I mean, Bernie Sanders, and indeed Barack Obama worked through social media. But what he was able to do was define his message and set it out. So it's about someone who has a clear set of beliefs and values, but then an ability to be able to engage in the less old-fashioned, traditional party line way. Right. Usually people go for politicians who seem bigger than their party because people aren't as interested in parties anymore.
Well, actually, you say somebody who has a more nuanced view, and I was thinking Jeremy Corbyn, who's been very successful, but he definitely has seemed bigger or an even alternative to his own party.
Yes.
So that's an interesting point in and of itself.
And I think Thatcher was bigger than her party. Yeah. Blair was bigger than his party.
Let me get some other viewpoints in. Lady waiting there. Yeah. That microphone. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Amina Etziselmi. I'm director of an independent consultancy. And we've talked a lot about the gap between the elites and the people. I don't know if it's a useful way of framing things, but it's something that has come up. And in terms of bridging that gap, whether it's a leader or culture or whatever, what's the role, do you think, of humor? There seems to be something about being outrageous and eccentric and funny that's very personable. And as evidence, I cite Boris Johnson or George Bush Jr., who I remember was described as someone you might like to go for a drink with.
Yes.
Even if you didn't.
I know.
So is there something, can you train people into being a bit more?
Well, what's often struck me is when I meet the politician in person, they're much more normal than they are on television. Something seems to take over when the TV cameras come on. It's almost as if this caution, this advice to rein it in, not see anything that might be held hostage to fortune, takes over. And I don't understand. Politicians always seem much more likable once they've left office, don't they? They always...
Well, Donald Trump is not taking caution at line, so
no.
proving your point, I think. Yeah.
But there is that. So I mean, I don't have a media operation to kind of. I don't know what the solution is, but it's something I've noticed that that politicians are almost scared of showing their human side. Now, it may be because the ones that are now attracting attention are the ones that seem more normal, if you can call Boris Johnson normal. But you know, a personality. It may be that might help in not just current politicians opening up, but in terms of the type of candidate that it attracts. There seems to be a spate now of, like in New Zealand, there's now, I mean, younger candidates who can appear a little bit more rounded.
Yeah, Stefan Kurz in Austria, very young.
Yeah.
Right. So first Julian and then Steve. Yeah, there, please. Keep your hand up so they can see where you're. Thanks. Microphone's coming.
Thank you. Gerard Russell, I run a consultancy firm, and was reading on the internet the other day, the Foreign Office has released a number of telegrams from the Hungarian uprising of 1956. And the embassy's staff didn't know what was going on. They saw great crowds in the street, didn't know what was happening, but were really struck that it must be serious because they saw people laughing. And laughter, they say, had been unheard of, really, in public, because the government would perhaps think it was being laughed at, and no one had dared to laugh.
Yeah.
So looking at your comedies, particularly the more recent ones, they don't, like Yes Minister, they don't point to a political outcome or a sort of solution, if you like, because Yes Minister was quite directive. It was very political. Margaret Thatcher loved it because it had a message. But perhaps do you feel that comedy has a certain political power all of its own, a sort of liberating power?
Well, I'd say, yeah, liberate. I wouldn't say comedy could change people's political views, and I think you're on a hiding to nothing if you think that. I think if you want to engage with people politically, if you want to try and argue for a particular viewpoint politically, you have to get actively involved in politics, or become a journalist, or you know. I think any comedian who thinks they can change how people will vote, I think. You know, Peter Cook had that quote about how he loved German cabaret in the 1930s and the tremendous effect it had on stopping the rise of Hitler. You know, it's just, you know, it just doesn't work like that. But you're right, it's a sort of, when we were researching the death of Stalin, the thing we encountered was that there were lots of anti-Stalin joke books circulating at the time with really kind of quite good but cruel jokes. Which, if you were found having one in your possession, you could be shot, you could be sent to prison. Yeah. And yet this desire to laugh, it's almost like, you know, the state can take, you know, my family away, they can take my livelihood away, but if I can still laugh at them, then they haven't got me. You know, they can put me in prison, but they haven't got this up here, if I can still laugh at them. And the fact that people risk their life by circulating joke books is extraordinary. It says something about, you know, the human spirit, in that it will, under dire circumstances, still find something funny, as if it's like, that's our way of showing there's still a bit of light there, you know, still flickering away.
And therefore the strongman phenomenon, which, as you described earlier, you're noticing, and in a way your Stalin film was about trying to get under that. Are they ultimately never going to be entirely sustainable? I mean, there's a big question we've had underlying this whole conference, which is whether the democratic system, the liberal order system, has an intrinsic strength which will make it win out, or actually maybe not, and that actually the more centralized...
You know, I'd say I hope it has, but the danger is you just assume it has, and therefore don't do anything else. You know, it won't take care of itself, because you know, it has to be constantly readdressed and re-engaged. But I'd also, to go back to the humor thing, you know, I'm always wary of the politician who doesn't like jokes about themselves, because that's the most dangerous politician, I find. The one who will either say, oh, that's not funny, or how dare you, that's unpatriotic.
That phrase has been used quite a lot, actually, the unpatriotic phrase. I think of trips to India, to Turkey, to the whole nation of nationalism and patriotism.
It's a very good way of smoking them out, really, is by telling jokes, because the ones that don't smile are usually the ones you have to be most worried about.
There. Keep your hand at the back.
Hi, Armando. First to say thank you for all the hours of pleasure.
Thank you.
I do want to press you, though, a bit on the queasiness about Stalin. I haven't seen the movie, and so in a way I want to ask you about the thought process before. Because in general, having watched your stuff, you're pretty sweet. I mean, the satire is good and it's funny, but basically it's not a really risky satire. And we know about Stalin. I lived and worked in the Soviet Union and then in Russia. He killed 60 million people. He was responsible for enormous famine in Ukraine, in Kazakhstan. He was an extraordinary tyrant on the basis of a real ideology. I mean, not just as a bank robber.
He wasn't really into wealth, really.
He changed borders. He's the cause of half the trouble in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, the whole nationality question. So can you just talk about the queasiness that I'm sure you must have felt as you prepared to do the movie? Now, many people say you've pulled it off. A few people say you haven't. I'm very eager to see it. So I make no judgment. I just want to understand better how you thought about making a film about really a man who was a monster.
It kind of goes back to what I was saying, you know, and without it sounding like a cop-out, I would urge you to see the film because, you know, my approach from the start was always in those areas where we're showing, you know, the awfulness of what happened. There are no jokes. I mean, you can't joke about it. And I thought one has to be honest about it, especially if the source of the comedy going on inside the Kremlin buildings is their kind of desire to survive and the decisions they come up with. I thought it was important that when we go to scenes of what's being shown outside, and you know, I'm trying not to turn it into a horror show. It's not graphic in any, but the full truth of what's going on is presented there. And I think that's the only way to do it. And you talk about what was the queasiness. I mean, my approach was to talk to people who had actually experienced this firsthand and to get them to talk through what it felt like. And also, in the early stages of my cutting the film, we would show it to people just to kind of, and you know, I'd say of those whose relatives had gone through it or who them personally had gone through it, who have seen the film, they've said two things. A, it's very funny, and B, it's very true. Those are the two things they've said. So, but it requires a lot of preparation. I think you don't rush into something like this. You have to take the subject matter. You have to respect the subject matter, and therefore work hard to get it. Hopefully, get it right.
No, I think sort of assumption we're doing this almost because of all that's happened in the last year. But it's interesting your point. You said you started this film before Trump, before
about 3 years ago, yeah.
3 years ago. So it's interesting we're now projecting onto it because you know, the release date becomes the conception. Marriott, Leslie here. First here and then 1, 2. Yeah.
Thank you, Marriott Leslie, Chatham House. Continuing the theme of areas where there are no jokes, where bad things have happened, and also where there are strong men. I'd be very interested to know whether you'd ever thought about the use of satire in countering terrorism, countering fanatical extremism, debunking.
Oh, absolutely, yes. I've worked with Chris Morris a lot, and I don't know if you've seen Four Lions, his film about terrible terrorists. I mean, but who seriously are, you know, in the, I think it's shot in Bradford, or might have got that wrong, it might be Sheffield. But again, it doesn't hold back from showing the effects of their beliefs on other people and ultimately on themselves. Where at the same time, it's a comedy, but it's a comedy that's, and again, going back to the earlier answer I gave, Chris spent years in those communities and getting to know the fundamentals of what radicalizes someone, how they then distance themselves from their family and, you know, in order to convince themselves that what they're doing is right. I mean, there is a sort of absurdity to any kind of system of belief that takes over so much that you then convince yourself that you're the only right person, not just in the room, but in the world. You know, there's a fantastic moment in one of those Adam Curtis films where he looks at a very radical group in, I think it was on the outskirts of Iraq, who was so radical that they started to turn on each other. There were only about 5 of them, and they all decided, each one of them decided that the other 4 weren't worthy. So, and in the end, there was only one left who then killed himself because he thought he wasn't worthy either. And it goes right back to, there's a fantastic book out, I forget the title now, it's just come out, about when ancient Rome became Christian for the first time, and all the fanatical Christians who wanted to be martyred were really disappointed that they couldn't be martyred anymore because there was now a Christian emperor. So they tried to think of new ways of being martyred, which was to throw themselves off cliffs. You know, so do a kind of suicidal martyrdom. So this is like perennial, and there is a, you know, it's horrible, but there's an absurdity there about it because it's logic careering out of control. You know, in the film, Michael Palin plays Molotov, who is so adheres to the party line that when the party line changes every half an hour, he's got to kind of almost rewire his brain to kind of then adhere to it. Yeah.
And would you, I mean, maybe you're not going to say what films you're going to do next, and you probably haven't planned them.
No.
Or maybe you started
I know what I'm doing next. It's not a satire. It's Charles Dickens' David Copperfield I'm doing next. You know? Okay. No swearing in that.
It would be so erudite we wouldn't understand it. But you know, here we are with the 19th Party Congress taking place in China.
Yes.
And there's a part of the world where, you know, thought has just been enshrined. Xi Jinping thought alongside Mao Zedong's and so on. Does this make you feel like this is some echo to the past? Does it make you think, that's fine, this can be this kind of way of managing a country can be adapted to today?
What's interesting is there is a kind of a groupthink, I think, internationally, to sort of just leave it alone, because
well, that's why I'm asking.
It has so many tentacles in so many economies now, and propping up, you know, half of America's debt, and, you know, you go around the Caribbean, the number of hospitals being built with Chinese money, and there's this tendency to therefore not call it out, you know, which is, which prompts me to kind of look a bit further into it before I say anything that isn't true. But it's interesting that there is a sort of collective silence in the way that I think there was a silence about Stalin in the 1950s, because he had been one of the allies. He fought with Russia, fought with Britain and the United States. We won. There's a kind of, you know, it's that thing of history being written by the victors. And there's an element of that going on there, I think.
Right, sorry, we had another question here. Yep. And then,
Thank you. George Myers, UNA UK and SOAS. I wanted to go back to the point that you raised previously, which is to do with comedians like John Oliver explaining key political facts. And the question I wanted to ask is more to do with how politicians might be avoiding the facts today in favor of rhetoric. So we see Theresa May with red, white and blue Brexit, or Trump claiming that everything that he does is tremendous. So what I wanted to ask is, in your opinion, how do we actually make politicians educate the general public rather than use their rhetoric for political points?
Well, I'd go back to what I said right at the start about explanation. There needs to be more of an appetite and a demand for explanation. I've always find the interviews that are most successful are the ones where the interviewer is asking the politician to go back again and just explain a bit more about what they meant by that. The ones that are least successful is when it becomes a game of, well, you said this. Are you saying this now? Are you saying, well, come on, one word, yes or no? That feels like it's a game. And I don't think anything factually comes out of that. But the ones I find most interesting. But I have to say, it is hard work. You know, the second type, the game, is obviously better viewing. But I find it interesting that it's print journalism at the moment. The thing that was written off as like outmoded, hasn't got a future, internet now is going to... It's print journalism is setting the agenda in the US with revelations on Trump, on Russia, on the emails, on Harvey Weinstein. It's almost like they've said, okay, we've lost that. Here is the news, because you know what the news is. You watched it online yesterday. So what do? Well, okay, here are some facts that you didn't know about. That's what we're now here to do. So I find that interesting. But I think also it's down to online and TV invigilators to be less concerned about scoring a point off a politician and more about drawing out an explanation. You know, I mean, I still haven't had it explained to me how you can be open to the whole world, as as Liam Fox says, and yet tell the whole world they can't come in. You know, and I know one's about immigration, one's about trade, but you know, we tried to do a trade deal with India, and India said, yeah, well, we should have freedom of movement then. So it fell apart. You know, no one's explained that to me. You know,
just we're coming close to the end here, and I think what I'm going to do is no. Let me just throw two last questions to you. What are you most optimistic about in the future?
I would have been more optimistic 3 years ago than I am now, but the thing I hold on to...
That's something.
The thing I hold on to is I think, especially the younger generation, are now waking up to the fact this isn't a reality show. This is real, and it's affected by what they do, and that they have to participate in it. And that means democracy won't just survive unattended. You have to tend to it, and you have to take part in it.
And it's always important to ask a satirist what they're optimistic about. I think that's a key thing. And maybe just as a closing thing, what was the most, if you have an answer to this, what was the most improbable thing in one of your films that was closest to the truth? I mean, whether in Veep or the thick of it, or just get an anecdote you thought, I can't, I mean, you gave an example of the cabinet next door, but...
Yes. I'm trying to think. I mean, just a coincidence, when In the Look came out, our minister is in a hotel in America watching documentaries about whales because he jokes, you know, if I put the porn on, it'll turn up in my expenses, my career will be over. And that was the week that the Home Secretary's husband
Jackie Smith. Yeah.
Jackie Smith had to apologize because she had claimed for some adult movies on the subscription channel. And it was just a bizarre coincidence. People thought we actually had dropped it last minute into the film, and I had to explain films don't really work like that. This film was shot a year and a half ago. You know, so these things happen.
Well, look, I want to make sure we have time. We've got time for lunch. We've got Adel Al-Jubeir coming, the Saudi foreign minister, from one type of conversation to another in 1 hour at 1:45. So before we say thank you, I just want to remind you, please make sure you're back in here, certainly by, 1:40, something like that. From the lunch, you'll be escorted back down so we can get set up for that. Lunch is going to take place upstairs in the gallery, the long room where we had lunch yesterday, for those of you who are here. Otherwise, you will be guided down the corridor and up the beautiful stairs to get there in a minute. But Armando, you've got a busy schedule at the moment, busier than probably maybe either of us expected when we invited you and you accepted to come here. But thank you very much. I think you gave some real insights. A lot of the conversation here, even though we're talking about international order, has been about the how can I call it, the substance of politics, not just the policies. How you do it, how do you connect with people, what drives it, which systems are proving most resilient. And I think your observations, really have been very helpful to this conversation. So thank you very much. Best of luck with all the future and the film.
Thank you very much. Thank you.